Today, we have what's one of my favorite topics, and that's the many sources of the Buddhist Dharma in our popular American culture. So I'm going to try and tie that together in several ways. But before I start, I thought I would just hold up a couple of different books for references. This is, I think most of you all have seen this book or seen the film, The Wizard of Oz. And if you look, you can see the yellow brick road right on the front. And we had toyed with seeing the yellow brick road, but everybody jumped up and down too much. So maybe we'll do it before the day is over. So that's one of the sources, and I'll explain that. When I was a boy, it was one of my favorite topics because my grandmother was what's known as an American Transcendentalist. She had she was a follower of Emerson's philosophy, and my mother was too. But she was also she was a school teacher and a great fan, and she taught mythology and lots of fairy tales, including Grimm's and Anderson's. But her favorite her favorite works were the Oz books by Frank Baum. And Baum, when he wrote The Wizard of Oz in 1899, around the turn of the century, from 1899, it was published in 1900. So that's 111 years ago. And it's still with us today, so you can see how much influence it's had. What I'm going to do today, and what was not so clear when I was a boy, and those books were given to me to read, many of them passed on from my grandmother to my grandmother would have been probably 6 or 7 years old, maybe a little bit older. She would have been 10 years old when Frank Baum's book, The Wizard of Oz, came out. So she was a little bit older than Dorothy was at the time. And so her father and mother gave her all those books. And Baum was enormously popular until he died after that, almost 20 years later. He died in 1919, and he lived in the Midwest. So I'm going to talk a little bit about him as we move along. The purpose of what I'm hoping that you'll get out of my talk today is to see that Buddhism, in many of its elements, has been with us a long time. It's not so recent in our overall culture as many of us have thought. I read a bio, I think, of Baum when I was in my early 20s, and it generally attributed most of his work to either political or social causes. In other words, his fairy tales they were for kids, and they were great fairy tales, and considered now to be some of the best that were ever written. But he had a single goal, and that was not to replicate the grimness of Grimm or the terror of Anderson. You can think of the Pied Piper, for example, who lured all the children away. His goal was to create a tale that made people feel better. That was his goal. And he had a lot of unhappiness in his own life. He had many relatives die young. One was named Dorothy, and just right after birth. And it was a constant thing in those years, as we all know, for people to die young of diphtheria or pneumonia or some other measles, tuberculosis, all those diseases that were around at the time. So just bear that in mind a little bit about Baum, and we'll come back to him. So there's some other names I would like you to keep in mind as I go along. William Emerson, Reverend William Emerson, who introduced Sanskrit to the United States in the early 1800s, around 1819, 1820, almost 100 years before Baum died. Ralph Waldo Emerson was his son, and he was what many people think today, even today, was that he represents the idea of progress and growth and idealism in America more than any other homegrown philosopher in America. Ralph Waldo Emerson went to Harvard when he was about 14 years old and got a great education. He was a minister, as many intellectuals were in those days. And he partnered up with Henry David Thoreau and other people to form a society, and they thought of themselves as Transcendentalists. They found their greatest understanding in the love of nature and the worship of what is in nature. And they thought of that in many different ways. But here's the key thought that has to do with Buddhism. The first translation of the greatest, maybe not the greatest, but the most influential Buddhist sutra was done by Thoreau. And that's not a well-known fact. It was published in the Dial magazine. His translations, which was published by Thoreau and Emerson and others at the time. And this was long before the Civil War. Thoreau died shortly before, when he was 41 or 42 himself, of tuberculosis. And Emerson lived to a ripe old age. But Thoreau was so influenced by the Lotus Sutra, which is a primary work of Chinese and Japanese civilization, not just from the Buddhist perspective, but for the entire civilization. Much literature, poetry, art, imagination in those cultures are based on the Lotus Sutra. It's really sort of like a Bible in the sense that it's got about 28 different books in it, and many of them tell different stories. And I think the Lotus Sutra, along with the Flower Garland Sutra, and that's one of the reasons Kathy read the reading she did today, because it refers to flowers and the flowers along the path. And she was reading, I was thinking about Dorothy's adventure with the poppies, when they all, I hope everybody remembers the story of the Wizard of Oz, when she was put to sleep by the scent of poppies, which we know is a source of opium today. So, but I think it can probably be shown that Thoreau's Walden was influenced by his reading of the Lotus Sutra and his time in Walden. He read enough Buddhism, and some Hinduism too, to take a different view of the progressive, puritanical view of life that was generally held in New England in those days. Nothing against that. But he was, in a way, he worked harder than anyone. He just did it alone in a sort of a repose in his little cabin by Walden Pond. So beginning with Emerson and Thoreau, and maybe even before that, if we go back to, you can even go back further than that. You can go back to the Founding Fathers and their reading of the Enlightenment thinkers, Leibniz, Voltaire. All of them had read many works of Chinese civilization that were coming into Europe, slowly but surely, because of the opening of the doors of China in those days. And remember that China was primarily a Buddhist civilization. One time it was all Buddhist. So it's the greater Chinese civilization is really the source of Mahayana Buddhism as we think of it today. It immigrated to Japan in the 6th or 7th century, and then after that, again, in about the 12th and 13th century. And then came to us with our opening, just a few more facts, just with our opening of the doors to Japan in 1854, when Admiral Perry sailed his ship into Yokohama and Tokyo harbors and compelled the Japanese to open their doors to the West. They had been closed for a couple of centuries because of bad experiences. And after that, we began to see rapid influx of Japanese and Chinese immigration. Chinese immigration built the Union and Southern Pacifics, as you know. So many people worked right here in Reno and all the way to San Francisco. So the first temples, first Buddhist temples in the United States were really in California.